The encounter lasted only a few moments. In those moments, split-second decisions had to be made. Decisions between life and death. Decisions like these would have crippled the normal person with fear, but instead of fear, Officer Waldman knew exactly what to do. Officer Waldman was well trained in the use of firearms, in the use of defense tactics, in the use of all the skills that he knew. He was familiar with everything that needed to happen in that situation. He was even familiar with Chicago Police Training Manual, which states that the use of a firearm is a last resort measure. The plaintiff claims that this last resort measure of using a firearm was his first choice, but truly, it was his last choice, the one that he didn't want to take, the one that he only had to use because no other options were available. Let's quickly review the facts. On the early morning of December 7th, 1996, Officers Waldman and Levy were driving around the area near the Humboldt Park area, patrolling the area looking for a burglar who had recently struck in the neighborhood. They were driving very slowly so that they could diligently check behind cars, so they could really pan the area to see everything they needed to see. As they were driving slowly, a car came up behind them who began to immediately flash his lights, honk his horn, and swerve back and forth, trying to get them to pass. Mr. Ramirez was the driver of this car. He testified that he just wanted to get home. But if this is true, then why did Mr. Ramirez follow the officers onto a narrow one-way street that they turned on so that they would allow Mr. Ramirez to pass? Why did he follow them down the street that was in the opposite direction of his home? A street that was narrow and he wouldn't be able to pass. He followed so that he could pick a fight with the officers. He pulled alongside the officers, rolled down his window, began yelling at them. Threats even. He said that, "I am sick and tired of all these idiot drivers in Chicago. If you don't apologize, you're going to be real sorry." Well, the argument escalated. Officer Levy getting out of his car and saying, "Sir, please move along," even identifying himself as a police officer. Mr. Ramirez refused to move along, escalating the violence until they were in each other's face. And a fight broke out, a violent altercation between Officer Levy and Mr. Ramirez. Mr. Ramirez, feeling that he had lost the upper hand, pulled out a knife, lifted it above his head, and plunged it into the back of Officer Levy. Now, Officer Waldman, on the other side of the car, watched in sickening horror as he heard the thud of the knife going into Officer Levy's shoulder and lifting with the rip of flesh. In that moment, he knew he had to do something as he saw the knife being raised again, potentially causing serious injury or even death to his partner. Yes, Officer Waldman drew his gun as he thought through all the possibilities in that split second. The plaintiff suggests that he could have yelled police. However, Officer Levy had already yelled police, to no effect on Mr. Ramirez. Doing so again would not have prevented the knife from coming down and killing Officer Levy. The plaintiff also suggests he could have fired a warning shot. When I asked Mr. Ramirez why he didn't fire a warning shot, or when I asked Officer Waldman why he didn't fire a warning shot, he said that in that moment, he believed that firing the warning shot would not have done enough to have Mr. Ramirez stop in his current path of plunging the knife into Officer Levy. When I asked Officer Waldman why he didn't engage in the fight, he said the man was crazed. He was swinging a knife around. If I had grabbed him, who knows what would have happened. I could have been sliced. Officer Levy still could have been sliced. It would have caused substantial injury to either me or my partner. These other options were not available to Officer Waldman as he ran around the car. And in that moment, as he saw the knife coming down, he had to make a split-second decision, relying on his years of training, his years of experience, and his extensive knowledge. of the Chicago statute regarding the use of firearms. He knew it was only a last resort measure, but that was all he was left with as he pulled out his gun and he shot Mr. Ramirez in the back. This decision was not a happy decision. Officer Waldman did not want to shoot Mr. Ramirez. In fact, in his statement, he states that he did not want to shoot him at all. This was not his first choice. This was not anyone's first choice. This was the only choice that could have happened to prevent significant injury or death to Officer Levy. Now, the plaintiff claims that there was no knife. They provide a mountain of circumstantial evidence to prove this. First, they say that the knife was locked on the ground and that there was no possible reason that this could have been. However, I suggest to you that one simple possibility is that when the knife was plunged into Officer Levy the first time, it was not fully locked. Thus, when it was dropped, without any significant pressure, the blade could have closed. There was also no fingerprints on the knife, no blood. However, there's not necessarily conclusive proof that there would have been fingerprints on the knife or that there would have been blood, depending on the way that it was held, depending on the way that it was stabbed. Officer Waldman and Officer Levy both know that it was stabbed. However, the plaintiff again says that because Officer Levy was unable to produce his shirt that was stabbed at the time of the deposition in the trial, that this obviously means that Officer Levy wasn't stabbed. Well, this shirt was ripped. It was completely cut by the knife. Would you have kept a shirt like that? These are not conclusive proof that there was no knife, that there was no stabbing. However, there is conclusive proof that there was a stabbing, since that very night, Officer Levy was treated at the hospital for a stab wound in his shoulder, just like Officer Waldman saw, and just like Officer Levy felt as the knife went in. You also heard testimony from expert Dr. Winston Marshall, who corroborated the story that as he was shot, Mr. Ramirez had the knife over his head, leaning back, ready to plunge it back into Officer Levy. This is the most likely scenario of what actually happened. Ladies and gentlemen, the suit here is about negligence. The plaintiff claiming that Officer Waldman was negligent when he shot him in the back, saying that there were other options available that he wouldn't have had to shoot him. This is just not the case. He couldn't have yelled police. He couldn't have fired a warning shot. He couldn't have engaged in the fight without risking substantial injury or death to his partner. This was not negligence. This was necessary. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, do not punish this officer for carrying out his duty and for doing what was necessary to save the life of his partner. Thank you.